Night fell over the city like a heavy blanket. Roberto adjusted the rearview mirror of his taxi, his tired eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the streetlights. He sighed, rubbing his stubbled chin. Another long night ahead. The streets, usually bustling, felt strangely quiet. Roberto shivered as a chill ran down his spine. Something in the air was different. He couldn't explain it, but an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. The radio crackled, startling him. Roberto quickly turned it off, preferring the silence. The shadows seemed to stretch, swallowing the corners of the streets. He watched as a black cat crossed the road, its eyes gleaming almost supernaturally under the streetlights. His phone vibrated, announcing a new ride. Roberto hesitated for a moment before accepting. The pickup address was in a distant, rarely frequented area at this hour. He swallowed hard, trying to push away the discomfort growing in his chest. He started the engine, the familiar hum of the car echoing down the empty street. As he drove, Roberto noticed that the city lights flickered more than usual. Some streets were completely dark, swallowed by the night. The silence was oppressive. No traffic sounds, no distant conversations, no music coming from the bars. Only the soft noise of the tires on the asphalt and his own breathing, growing louder in the quiet. Roberto arrived at the pickup location. A narrow, poorly lit street. Old houses rose on either side, their dark windows like empty eyes watching him. He stopped the car, leaving the engine running. Minutes passed. No one appeared. Roberto began drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, a nervous habit. His eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any movement. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, hooded, walking slowly towards the taxi. Roberto felt his heart race. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. The figure approached the back door. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Roberto held his breath. Then, in one fluid motion, the door opened. The air inside the car seemed to grow colder. Roberto watched through the rearview mirror as the passenger got in, their face hidden in the shadows of the hood. The door closed with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the silent night. "Good evening," Roberto said, his voice sounding strangely loud in the silence. "Where are we headed?" The passenger didn't respond immediately. Roberto could feel the weight of the gaze on his back, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. Finally, a low, raspy voice answered, "Drive straight ahead. I'll tell you when to stop." Roberto swallowed hard, turning on the meter with trembling fingers. As the car started to move, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving behind more than just that dark street. The night, he realized, was just beginning. Roberto guided the taxi through increasingly deserted streets, his eyes alternating between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The passenger remained still, a silent, oppressive presence in the back seat. The silence inside the car was almost tangible. Roberto cleared his throat, trying to break the growing tension. "So, quiet night, huh?" he tried, his voice sounding strangely loud in the confined space. Silence. Roberto adjusted the mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the passenger's face. The hood cast deep shadows, revealing only an angular chin and thin lips, pressed into a rigid line. "Late night appointment?" Roberto persisted, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "Drive." The response came in a harsh whisper, slicing through the air like a blade. Roberto swallowed, focusing his attention on the road. The city lights were fading behind them, replaced by long stretches of darkness. The asphalt ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowed by the shadows. A faint static began to emanate from the radio, which was still turned off. Roberto frowned, casting a quick glance at the device. Static. Strange. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, unable to hide the note of nervousness in his voice. "Just ahead," the passenger responded, their voice now lower, almost a murmur. Roberto felt a shiver run down his spine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He glanced at the GPS on his phone, trying to get his bearings. The screen flickered, the map distorted and unreadable. The streets were now completely unfamiliar. Abandoned buildings rose on either side, their broken windows like empty sockets staring into the night. Roberto didn't remember any area like this in the city. The radio's static grew louder, now accompanied by indistinguishable whispers. Roberto reached out to turn it off, but stopped midway. The whispers, they seemed to form words. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The passenger didn't respond. Roberto glanced at the rearview mirror again, and his blood ran cold. For a moment, he could swear he saw two glowing points where the passenger's eyes should have been. He blinked, and the vision vanished. But the feeling of being watched, studied, remained. The taxi continued driving through the darkness. Roberto had no idea how long they had been on the road. Minutes? Time seemed distorted, stretched like a shadow at sunset. Suddenly, a dense fog began to form around the car. Roberto slowed down, his eyes straining to penetrate the opaque whiteness ahead. Maybe we should stop," he suggested, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not safe to drive like this." "Keep going." The order was firm, undeniable. Roberto felt his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The world beyond the car windows had vanished, swallowed by the fog. The only sounds were the soft rumble of the engine and the ever louder static from the radio. Then he noticed it, the smell, a pungent odor of damp earth and decaying vegetation, like a swamp or a freshly dug grave. Roberto gagged, the smell invading his nostrils, making his eyes water. He coughed, feeling nauseous. What is that?" he gasped, covering his nose and mouth with one hand. The passenger began to mutter strange words in a language Roberto didn't recognize. The sound blended with the whispers from the radio, creating a disturbing cacophony. Panic started to rise in Roberto's chest. He needed to get out of there. He needed to stop the car, to flee. "Look, I don't think I can keep going," he said, his voice now visibly trembling. "I'm going to have to ask you to get out here." The murmuring stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. "You're already on your way," the passenger said, his voice now deeper, resonating in a way that seemed impossible in the confined space of the car. Roberto felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers ached. The taxi continued moving through the fog, plunging deeper and deeper into the darkness. Roberto felt as though he was being swallowed by something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for millennia. And as he drove, guided by a force he didn't understand, Roberto had the terrible certainty that his journey had only just begun. The fog dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, revealing a landscape Roberto didn't recognize. The city streets were gone, replaced by a winding road that twisted between ancient gnarled trees. The sky above was covered in heavy clouds with no stars in sight. Roberto blinked, confused. His heart pounded against his chest. This wasn't possible. They couldn't have left the city this quickly. Where are we?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fear. The passenger didn't answer. Nervously, Roberto glanced at the rearview mirror, only to find the back seat empty. He slammed on the brakes, the taxi skidding on the wet road. Roberto turned around, looking frantically. The passenger was gone. "This isn't happening," Roberto muttered to himself, running his trembling hands over his face. "This can't be happening." A low, rhythmic sound caught his attention. The GPS on his phone had come back to life, but the screen showed only a pulsing symbol, a circle with a spiral in the center. The edges of the spiral seemed to move, slowly spinning. Roberto tried to turn off the device, but the symbol persisted. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat as if the touch of it burned him. The radio crackled again, louder this time. Amid the static, Roberto could hear distorted voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The words overlapped, creating a cacophony that made his head throb. "Stop it!" he yelled, slamming his fist against the radio. The device emitted a sharp sound before falling silent. The silence that followed was deafening, Roberto could hear his own labored breathing, the blood pounding in his ears. He closed his eyes, trying to calm himself. When he opened them again, the passenger was back. Roberto screamed, shrinking back against the driver's door. The hooded man was sitting calmly in the passenger seat, as if he had never left. How did you? Roberto stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. The passenger slowly turned his head toward him. Under the hood, Roberto caught a glimpse of a pale, almost translucent face. The eyes were pits of darkness, with no visible irises or pupils. "You're already on your way," the passenger repeated, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Roberto felt a chilling cold spread through his body. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic gripped him as he realized he was trapped. "What do you want from me?" he screamed, tears of fear streaming down his face. The passenger didn't respond. Instead, he began to murmur again, the same incomprehensible words from before. The sound seemed to reverberate inside the car, making the air vibrate. Roberto watched in horror as the world outside the taxi windows began to warp. The trees stretched, their branches twisting like tentacles. The sky grew even darker, turning a sickly shade of purple. The smell of decay returned, stronger than ever. Roberto's stomach churned. He covered his mouth and nose with his hand, fighting the urge to vomit. Then he noticed something on the seat next to the passenger. A small dark object, glowing unnaturally in the car's dim light. An amulet. The passenger abruptly stopped murmuring. His hand, pale and with fingers far too long, reached for the amulet. "No," Roberto shouted, not knowing why, but certain that he couldn't let the passenger touch the object. In a desperate impulse, he lunged forward, grabbing the amulet before the passenger could reach it. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the world exploded into chaos. The car spun violently, as if struck by an invisible force. Roberto was thrown against the steering wheel, the air knocked from his lungs. Through his blurred vision, he saw the passenger dissolve into shadows, disappearing like smoke. The taxi kept spinning, faster and faster. Roberto clung to the amulet with all his strength, closing his eyes against the overwhelming dizziness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Roberto slowly opened his eyes, dreading what he might see. The taxi was stationary in the middle of a deserted street. The city lights flickered in the distance. Everything seemed normal. He looked at the amulet in his hand. It was a dark metal disc, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift under his gaze. Roberto swallowed hard, his heart still racing. He knew, without understanding how, that something fundamental had changed, that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. With trembling hands, he started the taxi's engine. The familiar rumble of the car was comforting, a reminder of the normal world he knew. But as he drove back toward the city, Roberto couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was waiting for him in the shadows. And the amulet in his pocket seemed to pulse, like an alien heart, reminding him that his journey was far from over. Roberto drove through the city streets, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The amulet weighed heavily in his pocket, its presence impossible to ignore. The city lights seemed distorted, colors blending in impossible ways. He needed to get home, to safety, to normalcy. Roberto turned right, heading toward his neighborhood. Or at least, where his neighborhood should have been. But the street that stretched ahead was unfamiliar. Abandoned buildings rose on either side, their broken windows like empty eyes watching his passage. Roberto frowned, confused. He was sure he'd been going the right way. He turned around, trying to retrace his route. But after a few minutes of driving, he found himself on the same unfamiliar street. "No, no, no," Roberto muttered, panic rising in his chest. He turned again, speeding up the car. Street after street, each turn brought him back to the same place. The same abandoned buildings, the same shadows that seemed to shift at the edges of his vision. The radio turned on by itself, emitting a high-pitched sound that made Roberto cry out in pain. He tried to turn it off, but the buttons wouldn't respond. The sound grew louder, morphing into distorted voices, speaking in an incomprehensible language. Roberto slammed on the brakes, the taxi skidding on the wet road. He jumped out of the car, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something rotten. Figures moved at the edge of his vision, shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Roberto spun, trying to follow them, but they always slipped away from his direct gaze. "What's happening?" he shouted into the night. His voice echoed strangely, as if he were in a space much larger than the street where he stood. A movement caught his attention. Something gleamed in one of the broken windows of the nearest building. Roberto cautiously approached, his feet feeling as heavy as lead. It was a piece of paper stuck to the broken glass. With trembling hands, Roberto tore it free, his eyes widening in horror as he saw its contents. It was a photo, his photo. Below it, in red letters that seemed to drip down the page, "Missing," and a date, today's date. "No, this isn't possible," Roberto murmured, his voice breaking. A sound behind him made him spin around. More photos were appearing in the windows, on the streetlights, on the walls of the buildings. Dozens, hundreds of them, all of missing people, all with the same date. Roberto staggered backward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then he noticed something in his hand. The amulet. He didn't remember taking it out of his pocket. The symbols on the metal disc seemed to be shifting, forming patterns that hurt his eyes when he tried to focus on them. And in the center, a spiral slowly turning, just like the symbol he had seen on the GPS. A low, guttural laugh echoed down the street. Roberto slowly turned, his body stiff with fear. The passenger was there, standing in the middle of the street, his face still hidden by the hood. But now Roberto could see something more. Shadows moved beneath the fabric, as if the figure were made of living darkness. "You were always meant to come to this place, Roberto," the passenger spoke, his voice reverberating in an impossible way. "All of you were." Roberto took a step back, his body trembling uncontrollably. What do you want from me?" The passenger extended a hand, long, pale fingers emerging from the sleeve of his cloak. In the palm of his hand, a symbol identical to the one on the amulet glowed with a sickly light. "Your journey," the passenger said, "your soul." Roberto felt as if the world was crumbling around him. Fragments of reality shattered, revealing a black, pulsating void underneath. "No," he screamed, turning and running. His feet pounded against the asphalt, the sound echoing strangely, as if he were running through a massive tunnel. He could hear the passenger behind him, not running, but somehow moving, always drawing closer no matter how fast Roberto ran. The streets twisted before him, shifting in shape and direction. Buildings bent over him, their shadows coming alive, reaching for him. Roberto saw an open door in one of the buildings and sprinted toward it. He burst through the doorway, plunging into the darkness beyond. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Roberto found himself in a long, dark hallway, lit only by a faint, pulsing light that seemed to come from nowhere. He kept running, his chest burning, his lungs begging for air. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, closed doors passing by in a blur. Behind him he could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, steady, relentless. Roberto saw a slightly ajar door ahead and threw himself through it, entering a dark room. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized where he was. It was the interior of his taxi. The amulet in his hand pulsed, emitting a faint light. On the passenger seat, a knife gleamed, its blade reflecting the light in an unnatural way. Roberto looked at the knife, then at the amulet. He knew, without knowing how, that a choice lay before him. A choice that would determine not only his fate, but the fate of all those faces in the photos. Outside, he could hear the footsteps drawing closer. The passenger was coming, and Roberto knew that, whatever his choice, the real journey was only just beginning. Roberto stood motionless, his body pressed against the taxi door, his eyes fixed on the gleaming knife on the passenger seat. The amulet in his hand pulsed with a sickly light, in sync with the frantic beating of his heart. The footsteps outside had stopped. The silence that followed was almost tangible, heavy with a sinister expectation. With trembling fingers, Roberto picked up the knife. The metal was cold to the touch, but it seemed to vibrate with a life of its own. He glanced again at the amulet, feeling as though the symbols were writhing, forming patterns his mind refused to comprehend. A sudden noise made him jump. The door handle slowly turned. Roberto held his breath, gripping the knife tightly. The door creaked open with a long, drawn-out groan, revealing nothing, just darkness beyond. Roberto hesitated for a moment, then, driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, he stepped out of the taxi. He found himself in a long, narrow hallway. The once elegant wallpaper now hung in moldy strips. The smell of decay was strong, mixed with something older, something deeper. Roberto advanced cautiously, the knife in one hand, the amulet in the other. The light emanating from the metal disc was the only source of illumination, casting distorted shadows on the walls. As he walked, the shadows seemed to come to life, moving in impossible ways. Whispers echoed through the corridors, words almost recognizable that sent chills down his spine. Roberto reached a large room. Furniture covered in dusty sheets formed grotesque silhouettes in the dim light. In the center of the room was a round table. Scattered on it, like a macabre mosaic, were dozens of photographs. With his heart in his throat, Roberto approached. The photos were all of missing people, like the ones he had seen on the street. But here, there were more. Each photo was accompanied by a note describing the moment of the disappearance. A taxi driver who accepted a ride late at night, a nurse leaving her shift, a student walking home after a party. Common stories, normal lives, all interrupted by an encounter with the unknown. Roberto felt his legs give way. He leaned on the table, his mind spinning. Then he noticed something familiar among the photos. His own image stared back at him. With trembling hands, he picked up the photo. The attached note read, Roberto Silva, taxi driver, missing on October 2nd, 2024. No, it can't be, Roberto murmured, his voice breaking. That's today. This is now. As if responding to his realization, the amulet in his hand pulsed stronger. The symbols began to glow, projecting themselves onto the walls of the room. The shadows took on form, transforming into human silhouettes. They moved in a macabre dance, reenacting the moments of their disappearances. Roberto saw himself, driving his taxi, picking up the mysterious passenger. He saw the moment he touched the amulet, the instant he crossed the threshold between worlds. You all made a choice. The passenger's voice echoed through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. You all accepted the journey. Roberto turned, searching for the source of the voice. I didn't choose this, he shouted. I didn't know. A cold laugh reverberated through the walls. Oh, but you did. On some level, all of you knew. The curiosity, the desire for the unknown, that's what brought you here. The shadows on the wall merged, forming the silhouette of the passenger. Roberto stepped back, raising the knife in a defensive stance. What do you want from us? He asked, his voice trembling. The passenger's silhouette expanded, filling the entire wall. Your stories, your souls, your endless journeys. Roberto felt as if the ground were opening up beneath his feet. The reality around him began to disintegrate, fragments of memory and nightmare blending into a kaleidoscope of horror. He saw himself, driving the taxi night after night, picking up the same passenger, making the same journey, an eternal cycle of fear and despair. No, Roberto shouted, pressing his hands to his temples. This isn't real. This can't be real. But as he struggled against the torrent of images, a terrible certainty crystallized in his mind. This was real. It had always been real, and it always would be. The amulet in his hand now burned, the symbols fusing into his skin. The knife vibrated with a life of its own, its edge gleaming with dark promises. Roberto looked at the objects in his hands, then at the wall where the passenger's silhouette watched him. He finally understood the choice before him. Accept the cycle, become part of this macabre dance of lost souls. Or fight, using the knife to sever the ties binding him to this nightmare. But as he considered his options, a cruel doubt crept into his mind. What if there was no real choice? What if every decision only led him deeper into the labyrinth? Roberto fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Despair wrapped around him like a heavy, suffocating cloak. And as reality continued to shatter around him, Roberto understood the true nature of his torment. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, but the horror of the known. The certainty that, no matter what he chose, the nightmare would continue. Eternally. Roberto blinked, the reality around him wavering like a mirage in the desert. The room and the abandoned house vanished, the shadows dissipating like smoke. He found himself once again in the driver's seat of his taxi, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. For a moment he sat still, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. Had it all been a nightmare? A delirium brought on by exhaustion from long nights of work? Roberto looked around, recognizing the familiar streets of the city. Everything seemed normal. The radio softly played some random song, and traffic flowed smoothly around him. But something was wrong. A sense of déjà vu so strong it made his head ache. He looked at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight, exactly. The same time when everything had started. With trembling hands, Roberto checked his pockets. There was no sign of the mysterious amulet. The knife had also disappeared. It was just a dream, he murmured to himself, trying to convince himself. Just a bad dream. But as the words left his lips, his phone vibrated. A new ride. Roberto felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, without looking, what the address would be. The same dark and isolated street where he had picked up the mysterious passenger. His hand hovered over the phone, shaking slightly. He could refuse the ride. He could go home and forget all this madness. But something inside him, a force he couldn't explain, compelled him to accept. The taxi moved through the city streets, which now seemed eerily empty. Roberto tried to focus on driving, ignoring the cold sweat running down his back. Finally, he arrived at the pickup location. The same dark street, the same shadows dancing at the edges of his vision. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, hooded, Roberto felt his heart stop for a moment. Was it the same passenger? Or someone new, another soul about to be dragged into the nightmare? The back door opened. The passenger got in, their face hidden by the shadows of the hood. "Good evening," Roberto said, his voice hoarse. "Where are we going?" The passenger didn't respond immediately. When they finally spoke, their voice was a whisper that seemed to come from far away. "Drive straight ahead. I'll tell you when to stop." Roberto swallowed hard, turning on the meter with trembling fingers. As the car began to move, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving behind more than just that dark street. The taxi moved through the night, the city lights fading into the distance. Roberto glanced at the rearview mirror, the passenger's eyes glowing supernaturally in the darkness. And so, the cycle began again. Another journey, another soul trapped in the labyrinth between worlds. Roberto understood then, with a clarity that filled him with deep, resigned despair, that this was his fate. Eternally the driver, eternally the guide for lost souls on their own journey into the unknown. The taxi continued forward, swallowed by the endless night. And somewhere, beyond the veil of reality, the original passenger watched, a dark smile forming on his featureless face. The journey continues, the circle closes, and the nightmare, as always, persists.